Um, right. Morning. Hope everybody is well and that you are enjoying your Easter holiday, and happy Good Friday if you do that sort of thing. I know that for lots of my students, Easter doesn't really mean very much, either because they're not particularly religious or not a member of that religion, but also because it's a long weekend where they're just getting their heads down and revising. So hopefully you've got lots of chocolate to fuel you through all your revision. But just before we get started, and again we'll start pretty much on 9 o'clock, I'm just going to have a quick recap of where we've got to. So first things first, the last thing that we read was chapter 4, which was the Carew murder case. And this is, but most people know this one quite well, so I'm not going to spend too long on this, but this of course is the thing that gets Hyde into serious trouble, isn't it? Trampling over the girl wasn't okay, but this is actual murder of someone prominent. And this is interesting. This is really important because he doesn't just murder somebody, he murders someone who has a good reputation. This is someone who is in some way powerful. I think he's a politician, isn't he? And he is, and he's presented as this lovely, innocent, old world kindness of disposition, yet something high too, as of well-founded self-content. So this is the guy who is murdered. And when his body is recovered, they find a letter to Utterson, and they decide to go and see him and see what he knows about it. And at this point, we see Utterson making that connection, that clear connection between Hyde and Jekyll and dangers that Hyde represents. And we go to Hyde's house. We see this woman who works there who's described as having an evil face, smoothed by hypocrisy. And that's where we left it. Now, before we dive into reading, I just wanted to talk, we've talked a little bit already about, the characters. And we've started to identify some things about them, and there are some more characters we can add on later, which we will do. We've talked about some of the themes. We've started adding some ideas about the themes and what Stevenson says about these things. But we've also got to start thinking about some of the symbols and the motifs that we see in this book. Doors. We know that the first chapter is called The Story of the Door. And we need to think about what it is about doors. Doors are things that separate two places, and the inside and the outside. They are the things that let us in or keep us out. With the story of the door, of course, the door that we see there seems dark and seems dangerous in comparison to the rest of the street in which it's in. We get lots of stuff going on at night as well. When Hyde comes out, he comes out at night, doesn't he? But most importantly, I think, is the letters and the papers. And I mentioned this the other day. If you're doing the Power and Conflict anthology, you will have looked at tissue, and you've probably been slightly bemused by tissue. Most students are. It's absolutely fine. It's a funny old poem. But what tissue is talking about and exploring is what paper does, what function it has in our lives. Actually, in your generation, probably paper plays less of a role in your life. But certainly throughout the 20th and 19th century, paper was vital. We have pieces of paper that show ownership of a property. We have pieces of paper that carry the news and information. We have contracts, we have letters, we have wills. All this paper detritus of our lives tells us about us and gives us clues as well. So these are things that we need to be thinking about, and we're going to go and take a look then at the incident of the letter. And as we've done before, we're going to read along as we go, and I'll pause every so often. I'll highlight some stuff and see what sort of things we can say about some of these big ideas. Okay, so, and I'm just going to press a button. Go. Okay. There we are. Okay. So it was late in the afternoon when Mr. Utterson found his way to Dr. Jekyll's door, where he at once admitted by Paul, and carried down by the kitchen offices and across a yard which had once been a garden to the building which was indifferently known as the laboratory or the dissecting rooms. The doctor had bought the house from the heirs of a celebrated surgeon, and his own taste, being rather chemical than anatomical, had changed the destination of the block at the bottom of the garden. It was the first time that the lawyer had been received in that part of his friend's quarters, and he eyed the dingy, windowless structure with curiosity and gazed round with a distasteful sense of strangeness as he crossed the theatre, once crowded with eager students and now lying gaunt and silent, the tables laden with chemical apparatus, the floors strewn with crates and littered with packing straw, and the light falling dimly through the foggy cupola. At the further end, a flight of stairs mounted to a door covered with red baize, and through this Mr. Utterson was at last received into the doctor's cabinet. It was a large room, fitted round with glass presses, furnished, among other things, with a cheval glass and a business table, and looking out upon the court by 3 dusty windows barred with iron. A fire burned in the grate. A lamp was set lighted on the chimney shelf, for even in the houses the fog began to lie thickly. And there, close up to the warmth, sat Dr. Jekyll, looking deadly sick. He did not rise to meet his visitor, but held out a cold hand and bade him welcome in a changed voice. I'm going to pause there for a moment. A few things I just want to mention. If you are fortunate enough to live near London, there is a place called the Old Operating Theatre, which is now a museum, and it is what it says on the tin. It is an old operating theatre, and it might be worth looking at this just to get a sense of, first of all, the room that Utterson has entered. You know, there's the theatre aspect. It is literally a theatre. We talk about an operating theatre because it has seats or places to stand so that people can watch. Operations were a performance in the 1800s. People would come and see what various surgeons did. You'd have the table in the middle, you'd have all your students around the edge, you'd have sawdust on the floor to mop up the blood. And that's where we are, although there are no people. This is bare, this is barren. Feels quite brutal, actually, all the bees. So we've got here this particular room. And then we've got the doctor's cabinet. And notice that it says here, even in the houses, the fog began to lie thickly. Now, this is another motif which is really worth noticing. Now, it's a motif, but it's also a historical truth. London was full of fog. And much of the time, it was full of smog. It lay heavy. It caused people to cough. Made it difficult to see things. When the fog got in, you couldn't see very much at all. And this is deliberate, you know. Stevenson is using this in order to give us general sense of what London is like, but also to start to obscure things, because things are obscure to Utterson at the moment. He has all this information. You know, he knows there's a guy called Hyde. He's got these letters. He's seen these wills. He knows about a murder. He knows there's some connection, but none of it makes sense yet. It is all obscured. And that fog is there to show how obscure it is. Okay. He did not rise to meet his visitor, but held out a cold hand and bade him welcome in a changed voice. And now, said Utterson, as soon as Paul had left them, you have heard the news. The doctor shuddered. They were crying it in the square, he said. I heard them in my dining room. One word, said the lawyer. Carew was my client, but so are you, and I want to know what I am doing. You have not been mad enough to hide this fellow. Utterson, I swear to God, cried the doctor, I swear to God I will never set eyes on him again. I bind my honour to you that I am done with him in this world. Note that formulation. It is all at an end, and indeed he does not want my help. You do not know him as I do. He is safe, he is quite safe. Mark my words, he will never more be heard of. The lawyer listened gloomily. He did not like his friend's feverish manner. You seem pretty sure of him, said he. And for your sake, I hope you may be right. If it came to a trial, your name might appear. I'm quite sure of him, replied Jekyll. I have grounds for certainty that I cannot share with anyone. But there is one thing on which you may advise me. I have received a letter, and I am at a loss whether I should show it to the police. I should like to leave it in your hands, Utterson. You would judge wisely, I'm sure. I have so great a trust in you." "You fear, I suppose, that it might lead to his detection?" asked the lawyer. "No," said the other. "I cannot say I care what becomes of Hyde. I'm quite done with him. I was thinking of my own character, which this hateful business has rather exposed." Utterson ruminated a while. He was surprised at his friend's selfishness, and yet relieved by it. "Well," said he at last, "let me see the letter." The letter was written in an odd, upright hand and signed Edward Hyde. And it signified, briefly enough, that the writer's benefactor, Dr. Jekyll, whom he had long so unworthily repaid for 1,000 generosities, need labour under no alarm for his safety, as he had means of escape on which he placed a short dependence. The lawyer liked this letter well enough. It put a better colour on the intimacy than he had looked for, and he blamed himself for some of his past suspicions. "Have you the envelope?" he asked. "I burned it," replied Jekyll, "before I thought what I was about, but it bore no postmark. The note was handed in." "Shall I keep this and sleep upon it?" asked Utterson. "I wish you to judge for me entirely," was the reply. "I have lost confidence in myself." "Well, I shall consider," returned the lawyer. "And now one word more. It was Hyde who dictated the terms in your will about that disappearance." The doctor seemed seized with a qualm of faintness. He shut his mouth tight and nodded. "I knew it," said Utterson. "He meant to murder you. You have had a fine escape." "I have had what is far more to the purpose," returned the doctor solemnly. "I have had a lesson. Oh, God, Utterson, what a lesson I have had!" And he covered his face for a moment with his hands. On his way out, the lawyer stopped and had a word or two with Poole. "By the by," said he, "there was a letter handed in today. What's the messenger like?" But Poole was positive nothing had come except by post, and only circulars by that, he added. And here we start to get the clues, more clues as to what is actually happening, because the letter didn't really come by a messenger. This news set off the visitor with his fears renewed. Plainly, the letter had come by the laboratory door. Possibly, indeed, it had been written in the cabinet, and if that was so, it must be differently judged and handled with more caution. The newsboys, as he went, were crying themselves hoarse along the footways. "Special edition! Shocking murder of an MP!" That was the funeral oration of one friend and client, and he could not help a certain apprehension lest the good name of another should be sucked down in the eddy of the scandal. Look at that. He's talking about the murder as a scandal. It's an interesting choice of word, that, isn't it? Not tragedy, but scandal. Almost as if, once again, reputation is almost more important than life. It was at least a ticklish decision that he had to make, and self-reliant as he was by habit, he began to cherish a longing for advice. It was not to be had directly, but perhaps, he thought, it might be fished for. Presently after, he sat on one side of his own hearth with Mr. Guest, his head clerk, upon the other, midway between, at a nicely calculated distance from the fire, a bottle of a particular old wine that had long dwelt unsunned in the foundations of his house. Let's just notice that. He's actually cracked open the wine. Remember, he's mortified a taste for vintages. Clearly, this is worth bringing out. The fog still slept on the wing above the drowned city where the lamps glimmered like carbuncles, and through the muffle and smother of these fallen clouds, the procession of the town's life was still rolling in through the great arteries with the sound as of a mighty wind. But the room was gay with firelight. In the bottle, the acids were long ago resolved. The imperial dye had softened with time. As the colour grows richer in the stained windows, and the glow of hot autumn afternoons on hillside vineyards was ready to be set free. And I'm just going to make a mark there because that's rather lovely imagery, isn't it? And to disperse the fogs of London. Insensibly, the lawyer melted. There was no man from whom he kept fewer secrets than Mr. Guest, and he was not always sure that he kept as many as he meant. Guest had often been on business to the doctors. He knew Paul. He could scarce have failed to hear of Mr. Hyde's familiarity about the house. He might draw conclusions. Was it not as well, then, that he should see a letter which put that mystery to rights? And above all, since Guest, being a great student and critic of handwriting, would consider the step natural and obliging. The clerk, besides, was a man of counsel. He would scarce read so strange a document without dropping a remark, and by that remark, Mr. Utterson might shape his future course. This is a sad business about Sir Danvers, he said. Yes, sir, indeed. It has elicited a great deal of public feeling, returned Guest. The man, of course, was mad. I should like to hear your views on that, replied Utterson. I have a document here in his handwriting. It's between ourselves, for I scarce know what to do about it. It's an ugly business at the best, but there it is, quite in your way, a murderer's autograph. Guest's eyes brightened, and he sat down at once and studied it with a passion. No, sir, he said, not mad, but it is an odd hand. And by all accounts, a very odd writer, added the lawyer. Just then the servant entered with a note. Is that from Dr. Jekyll, sir? Inquired the clerk. Thought I knew the writing. Anything private, Mr. Utterson? Only an invitation to dinner. Why? Do you want to see it? One moment. I thank you, sir. And the clerk laid the 2 sheets of paper alongside and sedulously compared their contents. Thank you, sir, he said at last, returning both. It's a very interesting autograph. There was a pause, during which Mr. Utterson struggled with himself. Why did you compare them, Guest? He inquired suddenly. Well, sir, returned the clerk, there's rather singular resemblance. The 2 hands are in many points identical, only differently sloped. Rather quaint, said Utterson. It is, as you say, rather quaint. I wouldn't speak of this note, you know, said the master. No, sir, said the clerk, I understand. No sooner was Mr. Utterson alone that night than he locked the note in his safe, where it reposed from that time forward. What, he thought, Henry Jekyll forged for a murderer, and his blood ran cold in his veins. And we'll leave it there for today. I will be continuing this with next week, and the other chapters are all up on the channel at the moment. Again, if you have any questions that you want to ask, or if there's anything that you want me to cover, do drop me a message at nicola@englishandhistorytutor.com, and I will try and make sure that I cover it in our next session. Have a lovely Easter,